I have to admit something. Those 30 under 30 lists,
Oh, yeah.
I have a really complicated relationship with them. Every year they come out, and you see some 22-year-old who's already, I don't know, founded a unicorn startup and cured a disease.
And runs marathons on the weekend.
Right. And I can't help but look at it and just think, well, I guess I messed up the timeline.
It's what you could almost call the prodigy industrial complex. We were just obsessed with early achievement. I mean, if you haven't disrupted an industry by the time you can legally rent a car, the culture kind of implies you've missed your shot.
And that's exactly what we need to get into today. Because, when people talk about being a late bloomer, it almost sounds like a consolation prize.
Right, like, don't worry, Grandma Moses started painting in her 70s.
Exactly. It's a nice story, but it doesn't feel very scientific.
And that is precisely where we need to correct the record. Today isn't about, nice anecdotes to make everyone feel better. We're looking at a stack of actual research hard neuroscience from says stem cell, economic theory, psychological frameworks that all suggest the late bloomer isn't an accident. It might actually be a biological imperative.
So the mission here is to see if we can back up this idea of blooming late with some, hard data.
We're going to try and dismantle this idea that your brain just peaks at 25 and it's all downhill from there. The fact is, for certain kinds of success, your brain can't be ready until much later.
Okay, let's start with the pressure then. Because that timeline, that feeling that you have to be great now, it starts so early.
It's what Rich Karlgaard calls the early achievement conveyor belt. And if
Yeah.
you look at the data coming out now, we're seeing this anxiety just explode in Gen Z. The pressure to get on track for success is starting before puberty.
That just sounds absurd. You're talking about, what, middle schoolers stressing about their resume?
Absolutely. Honors classes, tracking grades, constant assessment. And the problem isn't just the stress, it's what this system rewards. It rewards a very specific type of brain function. We're selecting for what you could call raw synaptic speed.
Meaning, who can raise their hand the fastest?
Literally, think about any standardized test you've ever taken. It's timed. So the kid who solves the logic puzzle in 30 seconds is labeled gifted. The one who takes 2 minutes, even if they get the same answer, or maybe even a more thoughtful one, they're just average.
This makes me think of that story from Scott Barry Kaufman. He's a cognitive psychologist now, but as a kid, he was almost completely written off, right?
His story is just the perfect and maybe most painful example of how brittle the system is. When he was young, he had these really severe ear infections that delayed his auditory processing. So he wasn't slow intellectually, but he was slow to hear things and respond.
Okay.
So a school psychologist sits him down and shows him a bell curve, a graph.
Oh, no. Please don't tell me he told a little kid, you're at the bottom of the curve.
That's essentially what he did. He pointed to the far left tail, the low IQ side, and said, "This is you." And then he points to the right and says, "And this is gifted." Kaufman spent years, believing he was just incapable of learning because a test measured his speed, not his actual capacity.
And that label sticks.
Yeah.
If you're told you aren't gifted at 10 years old, you just stop trying.
And the reverse is almost more dangerous. This is Carol Dweck's work. If you tell a kid they're a genius just because they're fast, they start to believe intelligence is some fixed thing they were born with.
Entity.
Exactly. So the very first time they had a problem they can't solve instantly, they just crumble. They literally don't have the tools to struggle.
So the conveyor belt breaks the quote-unquote slow kids by just ignoring them. And it breaks the fast kids by making them fragile.
And it ignores this basic biological reality that our genes are traits. They act like an orchestra. Not every instrument is supposed to play the first note. Things like executive function, emotional regulation, deep pattern recognition, they often don't fully come online until much, much later in life.
Okay, I want to push back a bit here,
Yeah.
because orchestra is a nice metaphor, but we have all heard for decades that the brain physically starts to decline after 25. You lose neurons, reaction time slows. Is there actual biological hardware that supports this late blooming thing, or are we just sort of hoping there is?
That's the widespread myth, right? The whole use it or lose it fear. But this is where we have to look at the Boldrini study.
Ah, the one from Cell Stem Cell.
Yes. Maura Boldrini and her team, they did autopsies on brains. The brains ranged in age from 14 all the way up to 79. They were looking specifically at the hippocampus, which is, central to memory and learning.
And I guess the assumption would be that an old brain in an autopsy would look, well, shriveled.
You would expect to see way fewer neurons, a lot of decay. But that is not what they found. In the healthy older brains, even the 79-year-olds, they found thousands of immature neurons.
Wait, immature neurons, as in they were new.
They were new, the brain was still manufacturing them. This is neurogenesis. The actual volume of that part of the brain, the dentate gyrus, it stayed stable across the ages. The capacity to build new neural pathways was just as present in the grandfathers as it was in the teenagers.
So the hardware doesn't just rust out. Okay, but I have to ask, if I'm generating new neurons at 50, why does my brain feel slower? I'm definitely not memorizing a deck of cards as fast as I did at 20.
And that's the other half of the equation. That's where we have to talk about myelin.
Myelin, that's the insulation around the nerves,
Yeah,
right? The white matter.
exactly. Think of myelin as the bandwidth on your internet connection. When you're 20, you have very low ping. You can send a simple signal like remembering a name or a fact almost instantly. That's your synaptic speed. But you don't actually reach peak myelin volume until your 50s. That fatty insulation keeps building up around the nerve fibers well into middle age.
So what does that upgrade get you then?
It gives you bandwidth. You might lose a millisecond of that ping speed, but you gain the ability to transmit huge amounts of complex data across different parts of your brain all at once.
Okay, so the 20-year-old brain is like a sprinter, but the 50-year-old brain is more like a supercomputer network.
It's a wide bandwidth processor. It can connect a historical fact to an emotional memory to a current economic trend all at the same time. And that is what we call wisdom. It isn't just a feeling. It's a biological state of having a fully myelinated, deeply interconnected brain.
That distinction between speed and bandwidth, that actually maps perfectly onto the different types of intelligence. I wanted to bring in David Gallinson's work here because he breaks this down so well in the art world.
Oh, Gallinson is fantastic. He's an economist, but he basically treated art history like a huge data set. He looked at auction prices, textbook citations, all this stuff to figure out when famous artists did their most important work. And he found two completely distinct curves.
The conceptual innovators and the experimental innovators.
Right. The conceptual innovators are your young geniuses. Picasso is the archetype here. They have a really clear idea, a concept, before they even pick up a brush. They say, I want to paint this specific thing, and then they just execute it. They find.
They find, meaning the search is short.
Or non-existent. They plan, then they do. And they tend to have these breakthroughs very early because they aren't relying on decades of accumulated experience. They're relying on a single, radical new idea.
Okay, but then you have the experimental innovators, the old masters.
These are the people who would drive that conveyor belt totally crazy. They don't have a plan. They just have a vague intuition. They paint something, they scrape it off, they paint it again. They are just plagued by doubt. They seek.
I seek. That was Cézanne's famous line, right?
Paul Cézanne. I mean, the man was apparently a torture to be around. He'd make someone sit for 100 sittings for a portrait and then at the end say, you know what, I'm not happy with the shirt collar. He didn't paint his greatest works until he was an old man because he was just figuring it out slowly through trial and error.
And this isn't just for art. It applies to science, too. Darwin was not a young prodigy.
Darwin is the ultimate experimental innovator. He didn't just have some flash of insight and write the book at 25. He spent decades, collecting beetles, looking at barnacles, writing letters, doubting himself. He published On the Origin of Species at 50.
This brings me back to that idea of fluid versus crystallized intelligence. If we strip away the academic jargon, how should we be thinking about that difference?
Okay, think of fluid intelligence, the young brain, as your raw processing power, your CPU speed. It's how fast you can solve a puzzle you've never seen before. That tends to peak early. Crystallized intelligence, that's your hard drive. It's the whole database of every pattern, every word, every social interaction, every mistake you've ever made. And that database just keeps growing and growing. So when Darwin creates the theory of evolution, he isn't using raw speed. He's querying a massive database that took him 30 years to fill up.
So if you're out there feeling like you're just spinning your wheels, trying things, quitting things, wasting time, you might actually just be in the data collection phase. You're an experimental innovator.
Precisely. You aren't failing. You are populating the hard drive. You can't query data you haven't collected yet.
But that presents a huge psychological challenge. I mean, it is really hard to stay in that seeking phase without just losing your mind. You feel stagnant.
And that's where someone like Erik Erikson comes in. We tend to think human development just stops when we become adults, But Erickson argued we are evolving our whole lives. And in our 40s and 50s, we hit this crucial stage of generativity versus stagnation.
This is the desire to build something that lasts beyond you.
It's this deep biological drive to pass things on, to mentor people, to build institutions, to parent. And this is where the so-called late bloomer superpowers really kick in. We gloss over these, but they are potent competitive advantages.
Okay, let's drill down on those because resilience, I mean, it's kind of a buzzword, right?
It gets thrown around a lot, yeah.
So what does it actually mean for a late bloomer to be more resilient than a prodigy?
Well, just think about the mechanics of it. If you're a prodigy, that gifted kid, you've probably succeeded at almost everything you've ever tried, and probably on the first attempt. You have no data on how to handle failure. You are incredibly fragile.
Right. The first time you get a C on a paper, you have a complete identity crisis.
But the late bloomers, they've failed. Repeatedly, they've been the average employee, they've had projects flop. So when a real crisis hits, a market crash, a firing, a pandemic, the late bloomer doesn't panic. They have what's called equanimity. They can say, okay, I've been in a hole before, I know how to climb out.
So in a chaotic world, you actually want the person who's taken a few punches, not the person who has never even been in a fight.
Exactly. And you combine that with insight, that ability to connect all these diverse dots we talked about, and you get a leader who isn't just reacting, but synthesizing.
But I see a trap here. We talk about grit and staying the course, but sometimes to actually bloom, you have to stop doing what you're doing. We need to talk about quitting.
Strategic quitting. It is maybe the most underrated skill in the late bloomer's entire toolkit.
And the Intel story is the absolute best example of this. But I feel like people learn the wrong lesson from it. They think it's just about pivoting. But it was really about an identity crisis.
It absolutely was. In the mid-'80s, Intel was a memory chip company. That was their soul. They invented it. But Japanese competitors were just crushing them. They were losing millions. The logical grit advice would be work harder, build better memory chips, fight for your market.
And the founders, Andy Grove and Gordon Moore, were basically paralyzed. They couldn't imagine Intel not being a memory company.
So Grove has this moment of brilliance. He looks at Moore and he asks this one question that changes everything. He says, if we got kicked out today and the board brought in a new CEO, what would that new guy do?
And Moore didn't even hesitate.
He said he would get us out of memory chips.
And then Grove says, why shouldn't you and I walk out that door, come back in, and do it ourselves?
That is the power of strategic quitting. They essentially fired their old selves. They quit the very thing they were famous for to focus on microprocessors. If they'd had grit, Intel would be a footnote in history. They had to quit to bloom.
That is terrifying, though, to walk away from your core identity like that.
It is, but sometimes the reason you aren't blooming isn't because you lack talent. It's because you were planted in the wrong soil.
You have this example from the textbook about the Ache Society in Paraguay.
Yeah.
That really highlights how much context matters.
This is just fascinating. So the Ache are forest foragers. In the U.S., if your toddler isn't walking by, 14 months, you're calling the doctor. You're worried.
Right, developmental delay.
In Ache society, children often don't walk until they're 23 or even 25 months old, almost 2 years old.
Why? Are they physically unable to?
Not at all. They're carried. The mothers carry them almost constantly because the forest is incredibly dangerous. Snakes, jaguars, rough terrain. If a toddler wanders off, they die. So the environment itself suppresses their walking.
So you'd assume these kids grow up clumsy or physically behind.
It's the exact opposite. By age 9, Ache children completely surpass American children in motor skills. They're climbing 100-foot trees, they're using machetes to cut trails, navigating this dense jungle.
So the delay wasn't a deficit.
It was a latency period. As soon as the environment changed, once they were old enough to be safe, the skill bloomed with incredible speed. And that's the takeaway for anyone listening. If you feel like you aren't walking yet, you have to ask yourself about the forest.
You might be in a carry phase because the environment isn't safe for your particular skill set to emerge yet.
Or you're in a job or a field that only rewards synaptic speed when your real strength is deep synthesis. You're a machete expert trying to win a 100-meter sprint. You're in the wrong competition.
That really reframes self-doubt, doesn't it? Usually we're told to just suppress that voice in our head that says, I'm not good at this.
And Carl Gard argues we should listen to it. Treats self-doubt as data. It's a dashboard light. Is the doubt saying, I need to work harder? Or is it saying, I am an experimental innovator stuck in a conceptual role? Use the doubt to find your proper soil.
So, okay, let's pull this all together. We started this deep dive with the feeling that if you haven't made it by 30, it's pretty much game over.
And the science tells us that is just objectively false. Biologically, your brain is still building bandwidth and generating new neurons well into old age.
Psychologically, you're just hitting that generativity stride where you actually want to contribute something meaningful, not just compete.
And creatively, if you are one of these experimental innovators, a seeker, you literally could not have succeeded earlier. You needed all that time to collect the data.
It makes me think about everyone listening who has that one project, the novel in the drawer, the business idea they sketched on a napkin 5 years ago and then just abandoned.
We look at those as failures. Oh, I never finished that. But if we apply Gallinson's theory, maybe those weren't failures at all. Maybe that was your research phase.
You were just collecting your barnacles.
Exactly. You were building the database. And now, with the myelination, the resilience, and the crystallized intelligence you've built up, you might finally be ready to execute on it.
So that dormant project might just have been waiting for your brain to catch up to the idea.
The clock is much kinder than we think. You haven't missed the boat. You were just building a bigger engine.
That is a thought worth holding on to. If you're feeling behind, maybe you're just preparing for a much deeper run. Thanks for diving in with us.
Always a pleasure.